Episode 5 of the circuit is now being recorded. How you doing, Jay?
I'm good. How are you doing, Ben?
I'm doing pretty good. You and I have had so much to talk about text-wise with earnings and debacles happening that's been fun. I'm excited about upcoming episodes where we digest maybe some earnings and dig into fun financial and investor economics. I'm just teasing a future episode. This is the point of my ramble.
Yeah. I should note that I talked to a longtime listener, Patrick, who said the thing he liked most about our show is how we just get right to the point.
Right
The
to the
topic.
point, baby. Right to the point. All right. So
Yeah.
on that matter, carrying on with our themes, kind of just looking at the high level of the industry, let's talk about architectures. We've got x86, we've got ARM, and we've got RISC-V really in the conversation. And, at a high level, I think this is important because you've got two players doing x86. Who knows if this gets opened up? Maybe if Intel's futures change, they license more x86 to whoever. I doubt it. I'm just throwing this out there as one of the thesis. But then we have ARM, which by nature of its license structure really kind of allows a lot of people to make their own architectures. There's a handful of architectural licensees which we may want to just explain, and then there's people who can just buy the standard IP and create their own SoC or design blocks and have those made at a fabless foundry. And so you get this really big ecosystem. And so those are the kind of the two architectures. Obviously, ARM much larger. x86 skews. This is obviously debatable, but let's say for the moment, x86 skews high performance. But yeah, it's an interesting battle, right? But you kind of only got a couple players on x86, Intel and AMD. You got a lot of players on ARM, but these two kind of dynamics still go head to head as Intel or as x86 tries to become more like ARM and ARM tries to become more like 86. Anyway, high level, a few things I think are interesting, and we can touch on the RISC-V stuff after, but I'll let you kind of chime in on your thinking on architectures.
So from a high level, I think you and I are going to have some areas where we disagree on, especially around the future x86 and its future.
I'm excited.
Is it really better, higher? Is it really higher performance? Let's dig into that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a really important topic. It's very, very timely. There's so much going on. You have Intel going through just an awful week with its earnings. We have all this drama around ARM for the last 2 years. Who owns it? What's going on in China? But underneath that, ARM is still everywhere. And then you have RISC-V, which I think I'm in the camp of being a big proponent of. Not necessarily, I don't have an opinion on it technically. I'm just saying I think it has incredible, I would argue, unstoppable momentum at this point, and it's going to start showing up in a lot of wild places soon.
Yeah. So let's go back to this, and I'll make a point that I'm not technically savvy enough in architecture design, but just conversations I've had. I've been told, and maybe you have a different opinion I've been told that there's theoretically no performance per watt benefit in either camp, x86 or ARM. So for example, if Intel would have started from the same place as ARM, I've been told theoretically they could have created a low power architecture, right? But this has been the struggle for x86. It just, for whatever reason, has not been able to be low power, and ARM has, right? But they started from two opposite spectrums. But I think that's interesting because that's not what I would have thought. My initial thought was like, look, it's just a power hungry process, right? Having a, not being a RISC-based processor, being one that's a little bit more computationally intense in terms of its clock cycles. My thinking was, well, hey, it's going to be power hungry by nature of the fundamentals of its technology, whereas a RISC based is not. And there we landed. But I've been told that again, it could have been efficient. It's just a flaw in the design, or again, just not the flaw in the design. It's the decisions or trade-offs that were made to really focus on more performance than more, efficiency. So I'll kick it over to you on how you see that.
Yeah, so I look at it two ways. One is the one you just touched on, is the trade-offs, right? Engineering is at some high level just an endless series of trade-offs, right? You have to make a decision. You can do this or you can do that, but you can't do both, right? And I think it's absolutely true that for much of Intel's history, they were making the choice always to go with higher power, better performance, because they were selling into the PC market, and that's what really mattered, right? How many clock cycles do you have? What's your clock rate? How fast can it go? How powerful is it? And that still matters a lot to a lot of people, a lot of customers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so you could argue that they just optimized in that way, and 30 years of path dependency made it structurally impossible for them to build a chip that was power efficient. I shouldn't say impossible. It just, like, they ended up here for a reason. It's not a bug. It's a feature. They made deliberate decisions that did them pretty well for a long time.
Right.
There's another argument though that I read recently. I'll try and find the link, where the argument was that the big difference between at a high level, the big difference between x86 and ARM is that complicated instruction set versus reduced instruction set, RISC versus CISC debate, which was a big thing in the 80s. And it wasn't so much. I think what people are saying is that RISC versus CISC isn't necessarily neither one is necessarily more power efficient. But when ARM came on the scene, after Intel x86 had already built up significantly, what ARM offered with RISC was just a very, very pared down instruction set. Right? There weren't all these complicated sort of use cases and extensions added, and so it was a clean slate in some senses, and it was able to then optimize for power efficiency. They realized that was their niche, and so they went that direction. If you extend that further, though, then you could say, well, after 20 years of ARM adding all sorts of extensions, we now are in a position where RISC-V is the cleanest, simplest one, and is going to be the most efficient, because it's so new. We don't have lots of extensions. We don't have lots of complicated things added into it over the years. And I think either path you take, I actually think that argument holds true, which is RISC-V is still very open, not in terms of open source, but like just sort of open in terms of what it can do. They haven't made a generation or two of optimizations or engineering choices that led them down one path or another, and that makes them a good choice for a lot of applications.
Mm.
And eventually, 20 years from now, RISC-V will get all kludged up too, and we'll go to whatever's next, or maybe. So I look at it in that context, where there is no perfect. It's always a series of trade-offs.
Yeah.
RISC-V is here at the right time with an open slate, and I think some people would probably argue that RISC-V, because of how it works under the hood, is going to remain much more flexible, because customers, designers can now mix and match, and they don't have to necessarily add all the kludgy extensions that slow it down. So they can have, we will have RISC-V chips that are optimized for high performance, and we'll have RISC-V chips optimized for low power. And it's easier to do because it's cleaner, it's newer architecture.
Yeah. So I guess I'll add a few more points that at least how I think at this at a high level. So there's categories where we've seen successive architectures, and then there's categories where those architectures have been challenged. Now, there's nuances as to why, but an example is one, the PC market has largely been dominated by x86. Obviously, Apple has changed that in terms of their ability to do their custom architecture around ARM and hit all of the vectors. But as we talked about, before, Apple's unique in the way that they can develop software and whatnot. So in the Windows world, it's been x86, and obviously in the data center, it's been x86. Now, there's Qualcomm's trying to enter the Windows world with a part that'll be shipping next year, based on Nuvia. They've outlined. We'll see kind of where they go. Obviously, right, when you kind of start from scratch with a custom architecture, again, kind of like Apple, you can get rid of some of that crust, like you talked about. But the example that I think is most interesting, and I actually really want your perspective on this, given what you did with Qualcomm, is server. And the example I'm going to use is Ampere Computing, because I think they're super interesting. Not that they're the most dominant player yet, but they're certainly somebody with a player. But they took this approach that we're kind of talking about, and especially to some of those points you made about RISC-V, which is that x86 designed data center parts were really designed for the desktop, and then they were scaled up and made for the data center. And Ampere's entire point is this is a custom architecture, obviously based on ARM. They're an ARM architectural licensee that was built from the ground up with cloud in mind. And by doing so, there's some efficiencies, right? So very similarly that Apple built M-series silicon or A-series silicon really with a purpose in mind, got rid of all that crust with a purpose in mind. It's delivering on their plans and executions. That's kind of Ampere's value proposition. And again, ARM servers or whatever you want to say today, 3%, I don't know, something like that. But you were there when Qualcomm attempted this, obviously really, really hard. ARM wants this to go there. But I think this approach of getting rid of the crud, rethinking the architecture, having a very specific focus on how you've designed it, is kind of, I think, hinting at some of these directions that we're going architecturally, whether that's ARM really or RISC-V, I think.
Yeah, I think I'll just lay all my cards on the table now. I'm a big believer in ARM in the data center, right? I think we are past some key inflection points, and I think that the main sort of stumbling blocks that sort of made it take so long is x86 on a core for core basis. You look at an ARM core versus an x86 core. The x86 cores are bigger and they are higher horsepower. And so for a long time, ARM's argument was, yeah, you're going to need, you can use smaller ARM cores. You'll need more of them. You can fit more in a chip, and we'll be lower power. And then somewhere in the last 2-3 years, the argument flipped and it stopped being about ARM having better performance per watt. It wasn't about power efficiency. It just became about raw performance. And I think if you look at there are a bunch of use cases people have written about. They've used ARM servers in the data center for done like for like comparisons and found much better performance on their whatever ARM server CPU than what they're getting on x86. And I think there's some applications, you have to look at it really granularly, because there's some applications that will work better on x86 no matter what, and there's some that will work better on ARM. But yeah. I think we're now at the point where ARM performance is highly competitive with x86. Certainly better than Intel, possibly better than AMD. And I think that's a crucial turning point, because you get all that performance and you still have lower power.
Right.
And yeah, I think Ampere is doing a great job. There are other problems that they have to contend with, like software. That's another huge problem in the data center, is getting all the software to work. But Ampere has done a great job. Amazon with Graviton is right. Phenomenally performative. So we're past some sort of key tipping point where I think ARM in the data center is at the point of acceleration, and we're just going to see a lot more of it in coming years.
Yeah, I agree with you from a software and application standpoint. And really in this scenario, we're just talking about the CPU, which I think is still relevant. But obviously, a lot of just basic cloud applications, cloud databases, website e-commerce. Ampere's proven to run that extremely well and at low power. So you made the point about some key milestones, and you talked about performance, being one of them. Were there other sort of milestones that you thought, once we pass this point, the hood's off, the gap pedals to the metal, and ARM has this opportunity? Is there anything else on those milestones that you observed?
Well, I think the other big one is software, right? Because Intel did a phenomenal job for 20 years of building up the software ecosystem to run on the data center. That's Linux, but then hundreds, thousands of other software applications that we don't necessarily think of, open source ones, databases, all kinds of stuff. A big part of the struggle was for Qualcomm and for Ampere now is getting software to run on ARM. And at some level, you can hit compile. You can just click a different configuration setting on your compiler, and the code will go either way. It'll go from C++ into x86 or ARM. The problem isn't the compiling. That's like 80% of the work. It's that last 20% of optimizing the workload to get it to be as performative. And we've been doing that for a long time with x86 software on x86. It's been very painful to do that on ARM, but I think we're getting there. We're seeing big software, a lot of the big software companies, a lot of the sort of compilers, GCCs now works perfectly well on ARM. Like a lot of that work has been done, right? Qualcomm did some of it. Ampere's done some of it. Amazon, I think, has been the real big push behind a lot of some of this. So I think we're at, this one's very hard to quantify because it's just all software. But I think we're, just anecdotally, it seems like a lot of the big tools are now optimized for ARM. And that's going to be a big enabler of the whole ecosystem.
So I'm curious on your take then, because Ampere they're an architectural licensee, which basically, if people don't know what that means, it means that they take the ARM instruction set and create a custom architecture versus someone like MediaTek or really Marvell or Broadcom, who mostly just use off-the-shelf components for ARM. Do you think so? Ampere's again an example of being an architecture like obviously Apple, right? So these are two specialized architectures that, for their purpose and design, have carved out a value proposition. Do you think that's necessary, or do you think ARM, by nature of where they'll take IP, any basic vendor can come in and do this? Which I'm essentially saying, could someone just come in and end up challenging, right, Ampere or others with a basic ARM part, or will these need to be specialized architectures?
I'm not sure how many more people are going to want to build an ARM CPU.
I think so too.
Right. We have Ampere. We have a bunch of internal projects at the cloud scalers. So then you're talking about a startup, and no startup can afford an ARM architecture license.
Right.
So at this point, and I think ARM implicitly, if not explicitly, is trying to move away from architecture licenses. So I think it's going to get a lot more challenging.
Totally. So on that point, then if somebody's going to enter the data center with a standardized part, right? So Amazon's is custom, Google could do custom, right? Microsoft hasn't yet, perhaps they do. But if somebody was going to come in and offer a solution to challenge Ampere, you think that it would just be a generic ARM kind of vendor license or vendor silicon approach with nothing really customized, but an optimized approach for data center on standard ARM IP. Yeah,
I mean, just trying to think about who else is building an ARM CPU. Others, you have some subset of the hyperscalers. You have Ampere. Marvell is still working on something, I think, and then NVIDIA.
NVIDIA is, yeah,
right. NVIDIA, and so those are all companies that either already have or can get architectural licenses.
Right.
There's probably a couple companies in China that I'm forgetting that do as well. In fact, there are absolutely probably about a dozen companies in China building ARM CPUs, but those are different. Let's put those in a different bucket for now.
Right.
I
Right.
don't think they have architectural licenses. I don't think they want them. They're
Right.
optimizing for something different. Other than
So
that, I don't see anyone else getting it. If anyone else is out there thinking about building a ARM CPU for servers in the data center, and you're at a startup and that's what you're thinking about, call me.
yeah,
Let's get a drink.
exactly. Tell us. Yeah.
I'll buy.
Please tell us. Yeah. And I asked just to say like,
Oh no,
well, no, I'm saying I asked because it's kind of gives us a framework for who's going to be there, right? It's kind of already settled who will make their plays, which is kind of my point. I just trying to get a view of the landscape, but I would agree with you. I mean, Marvell had something shutting that down. I don't know. I'm a bit more optimistic on what NVIDIA can do. I think they're going to make a really interesting run at the CPU side to go along with GPU and CUDA. But yeah, point being, it's unlikely someone comes out of the blue, even with a standard ARM IP, and creates a product. Which again, just kind of goes back to my point. These are relatively specialized approaches, which I think is a prerequisite to maybe go after some parts of these markets and really challenge x86 in this regard in data center.
Yeah, but I agree. I don't think anyone else is going to do it, and I think the bigger issue is, well, I think there's two other issues. Is the market itself is the CPU market itself is highly, let's call it dynamic, right? Because you have ARM entries coming, you have the hyperscalers themselves trying to do something in CPU land, but then we're moving to much more heterogeneous compute in the data center. So the actual number of CPUs we need as a share of the total silicon pie in data centers is shrinking. Right? Much more GPU, much more AI accelerator, much more special purpose custom stuff, like we talked about a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
And so I think the overall market's going to grow and the number of CPUs is going to grow, but the share of silicon wallet for data centers, CPUs is going from 90 to, I mean, it was at 95% a few years ago, and it's got nothing to do, got nowhere to go but down from here.
And I think what just really interests me about this, to be honest with you, is really how kind of every landscape we're talking about, these little pockets of success or strategies where we think people will be competitive is truly moving away from general purpose silicon to much more specialized approaches. And I just think that's a really interesting shift, trend. Do you know what I mean? Like monumental move in the market. I don't know, but for every company thinking about strategy, that's a huge point to wrestle with, that this is really becoming much more specialized broadly in silicon.
Yeah, and it's one more reason that I sort of get very anxious about Intel. I mean, not to beat them, but not to dogpile on them, but they've got so many other problems they have to deal with right now.
Yeah,
like even if they do climb their way out of this hole, they're gonna emerge into a radically different world, right? In which suddenly the thing that they've been fighting so hard to do, like have the best CPUs, that's gonna be much less important in 2025 and 2026 or whenever they get to performance parity.
Yeah. All right, and we'll talk about Intel, I think, in the episode we're hinting at for next time. All right, let's talk about RISC-V. I know almost every major semiconductor company has a RISC-V project. It's being looked at by everybody. I don't know how. I mean, it feels like a non-secret secret. These things take time. Obviously, it's standard. But to this discussion, right? If RISC-V is used in a specialized approach, it makes it a bit easier to be application or category specific. So one, I just kind of want you to launch into on, I know you're bullish on RISC-V, but I also want to talk about it in relation to China, and maybe just weave in, because you're probably closer to this situation than I am. It's a bit of a debacle in ARM in China. If they IPO, I do kind of worry that some of that gets cut off. Clearly, governments can play into that. But RISC-V actually presents a really interesting opportunity for China to kind of start from scratch with the architecture and then, again, utilize that more broadly within all of the applications and their ambitions for custom silicon.
There's a few things in there, right? There's a few threads in there to untangle, right? There's a lot going on. So let me start with ARM China and work from there, because I think ARM China was a fantastic soap opera for a few years. Who owned it,
Mm-hmm.
controlled it. I think that's mostly been resolved, and I don't think it's an overhang on the IPO anymore. Certainly, we have geopolitics that's going to play a role in this, but it's not like there's screaming problems at ARM China anymore. Those have been settled. However, while that was going on, while ARM was part of SoftBank, and while they went through almost becoming part of NVIDIA, the China semiconductor market exploded, and you now have thousands of fabless companies in China who are designing chips. And when they needed an architecture, x86 wasn't on the table. So the choice was ARM versus RISC-V. And RISC-V is free, right? It's as simple as that. RISC-V is free. ARM costs X million dollars to start off with. So if you're a 10-person startup in China, the choice is pretty obvious. And I think actually beyond the sort of the drama and the superficial stuff that was happening with ARM, they have a sort of deeper fundamental problem, which is their pricing model is inverted. And what I mean by that is, if you're a big ARM licensee today, you get the cheapest pricing. If you're a startup and you want to go to ARM, you have to pay the highest royalty rate there is. And I think that is made it very, very hard for chip startups to want to engage with ARM. Just they can't, too expensive. And then you now have RISC-V, which is not perfect, but it's a very workable alternative, and it's ready to go. And I think that's been very appealing to thousands of companies in China, plenty of startups here. And then you sort of add on to that the drama around is it going to be part of NVIDIA or not? Are we going to get sued by ARM? That's made all the big US chip companies radically accelerate all their RISC-V ambitions.
Yep.
So that's my bull case for RISC-V.
So how do you then give a lay of the land on I guess the China RISC-V part of this? So one, I have a question that is their broader ambitions potentially limited by internal lack of process leadership, right? I mean, I don't know where SMIC really is. I strongly doubt their 7 nanometer leak or is legitimate, but they'll make progress right past 16 and whatnot. But I guess how much does RISC-V really even matter on leading edge process? And then I guess is that a challenge to its adoption? Because I know a lot of its applications today are not leading edge. So yeah, maybe how do you see that part?
So I mean, that's less an architecture question and more just a sort of what's going to go on in China. And I think most of those 2,000 fabless companies in China have access to whatever production node they need, whatever process node they need. There are obviously plenty that 30, 40 on the entity list that cannot get access to TSMC.
Right.
So there's 1,960 that still can. A big question that China watchers are asking, China semi watchers are asking, is like, how much further will this go? How far is the BIS and the U.S. government going to take this? And we don't know those questions. That's a whole other hour podcast about that. But for the most part, right now, all those thousands of Chinese chip companies can get access to TSMC. To your point, they don't always need it. A lot of them are perfectly content building automotive, industrial parts, embedded parts on trailing edge fabs, which they can get wherever they need them. I think what's really interesting to me in China around RISC-V is the extent to which it's being used for every application imaginable. It's not just China. I think that's here too. Certainly, a lot of the initial progress that RISC-V made in China was around industrial and embedded solutions.
Mm-hmm.
But increasingly, it's showing up in lots more advanced processes now, or lots more advanced applications now. And I think that's certainly, I mean, that's true. It's true here, right? There's a RISC-V core in every iPhone now, I think, or multiple RISC-V cores. Google is talking up RISC-V in big ways in TPU. I just recently met with a startup who's in stealth mode, so I can't name them, but they're building a server grade CPU based on RISC-V, and I'm staring at their performance data now, and it looks pretty compelling. So that's like the far other end of the spectrum from industrial stuff. This is like cutting edge server CPU stuff.
Yeah.
And to your question earlier about like, do you need an architectural license for ARM? You don't need one for RISC-V, or it comes with it. You just click through.
Right.
So,
and that's why I think this conversation around RISC-V is super interesting, because again, if everybody believes the point that we were talking about, that we're moving from general purpose to much more specific purpose applications, and so companies who deploy this may own more of the software stack, whether that's again data center platform, compute, whatever, that fits really well with RISC-V, right? It lends itself to that approach, I think, because again, it's going to lend itself to more specific purpose applications than general purpose. But most people would think about the semi world in a general purpose bucket, not unpacking that, hey, we're moving to much more special purpose parts, and that's a reason why this play gets really, really interesting. Even if it's not the CPU, even if it's just accelerators or companion parts, you own your differentiation with those bits because you've controlled some part of that stack.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because if you think about it, like fairly early on, ARM had a reputation for being low power. But if you ask yourself today, what's the real advantage of RISC-V versus ARM or x86? You don't have a snappy answer like that. Oh, it's not. It doesn't just stand for one thing. You can do. People are going to try and do everything with it. Now, maybe we'll get down this path a few years and we'll realize it's only good for certain things and not others. But I think that there is enough flexibility built into it that you can sort of build whatever you want, and I think that's part of what makes it interesting. Now, I do think that companies building CPUs and sort of general purpose parts on RISC-V are going to have massive software problems.
Yeah, that's true.
Because I just talked about that. It took 10 years for ARM to solve that problem. It'll be interesting to see how these companies approach it. But there's set that aside. If the world's becoming more custom, and RISC-V, maybe that's RISC-V's elevator pitch. Oh, we're the customizable one. I think that's kind of where we're headed.
Well, and they're also the free one. Economics is a huge point.
Free one, yeah, right.
So I think I know your answer, but I just want to lob it out there. So is there a category where you think RISC-V might take off and become more embedded faster than another category?
So I have two answers, and one of them is straightforward, and one of them I think is going to be controversial. The first one is, let's just call it IoT, like all the random things in this world, industrial, home networking stuff, refrigerators, like IoT. I think I've actually published a piece on this where I've said that's already lost. That's like ARM has lost that. That's going to be
okay.
RISC-V, except for a few leading US companies that are already in the space who will probably be with ARM, but it's certainly in China, all those low-level devices that come out of China, that's all going to go to RISC-V.
Okay.
That's a straightforward. The other one, I think there's a very good likelihood that AI inference at the edge is going to become RISC-V.
Why?
Right. And I think one, I'm just speaking empirically, I see a lot of it, but I think what's happening is, I mentioned at the header of this is RISC-V is a clean slate,
mm-hmm.
and it has none of those complicated instructions, custom extensions, and stuff like that. All that's stripped out. That actually leads to a pretty efficient processor. You can make a pretty efficient inference processor for low power devices. And I
Yeah.
think that's very powerful. Right.
Yep.
And certainly it just like yeah, that's where I think the market's headed. And I've had a lot of people tell me this.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I mean, I know of at least two or three companies doing this on RISC-V at scale that I think is interesting. I thought you were going to say automotive, so I was incorrect. But
Oh,
that was my just because and again only because I feel like one automakers will need to differentiate more heavily in a software defined vehicle future, whatever that is. Therefore, more specialized silicon platforms, they control more of the stack. So that's why I was like, well, maybe automotive becomes an area where it checks these boxes that we're talking about, right? From a differentiation and a strategic advantage viewpoint for something like RISC-V. So that's why I thought Jay might say automotive, because I know you look at that space so much. It's
yeah,
okay.
I've been I've been deep into automotive electric vehicles for the last month. And actually, I'm scheduling meetings at MWC, and offered me a briefing, and they gave me a choice of who I want to talk to. I said I want to talk to automotive people, because I'm not quite ready to rule out ARM in the auto yet.
All right. All right.
We'll see. It's because I think it's one thing for Xpeng or Neo or one of these startup uh, EV companies in China to experiment around because they're all sort of doing their own chips. Yeah, that probably is gonna be RISC-V. But are Ford and GM gonna go down that path? No, I think they'll only do that if Qualcomm takes them there, and Mobileye, right? And so I don't. Mobileye isn't doing that. Qualcomm. We'll see how this lawsuit goes. Maybe that's what happens.
Yeah, we could do a whole episode on that lawsuit, but
I
I
will
don't want
say
to
that
piss
there's a
off too
RISC-V
many
summit, right?
people. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But there was a RISC-V summit right before the holidays, and there
Yeah.
was a SVP from Qualcomm gave a
Yep.
talk, and he said, he said Qualcomm has shipped 650 million RISC-V cores,
Yeah.
which is a big number, except like Qualcomm probably ships 4 billion chips a year, so
Yeah.
it's probably a few billion ARM cores every year. It's a good start. But I didn't hear him say this, but somebody else told me that he in that same talk he said Qualcomm has plans to move all their mobile stuff off of ARM to RISC-V over the next 10 years.
That would just be.
But
I don't think that's public, but that might be speculation. But again, not. I don't want to get too deep into each here, but you're exactly right. What you said about ARM trying to pressure or change model with licensees, that's going to rub licensees the wrong way. If that doesn't get resolved, RISC-V is a nice solution. And again, if you control enough of the software stack in your applications, you can actually go and do that. Like that's the one thing. Like I don't think Apple has any need to move away from ARM because they have a very nice deal with ARM. But you could always argue Apple would be one of the easiest to switch to RISC-V because they control the entire stack, right? Mm-hmm. The more vertical you are, and that's just what to my point of that. I think automotive is interesting. Is it will? I really do think in a future of software defined vehicles, it's going to be highly competitive, and so differentiation is going to be even more important than it was in this previous sort of cycle. Because of that, I would argue there's going to be a little bit more need to be vertical and specialized in your approach to automotive. So Ford might need to be vertical, right? GM might need to be vertical, et cetera. I think you could make an argument. And then if that's the case, again, we could talk about how much then custom silicon accelerators, whatever that is, they need, because they, again, need to have much more specialized approach than just buying off the shelf parts from all the same vendors.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, it's kind of hard to have this conversation because, and I'm constrained to auto land now. Like, we don't really know what the software stack of the car is going to look like for electric vehicles, let alone autonomy.
Right.
And so there's a lot that can change, right? And so, certainly in autonomy, NVIDIA's made some pretty heavy investments there, and
yep,
they're perfectly happy to stay on ARM. They're in no hurry to get the RISC-V. I think there's just a lot of big questions. I take your point though. Like RISC-V is about customization. That's my new elevator pitch. And so,
Yeah,
we're the customizable one. So you want to customize that. I do think our RISC-V will struggle with general purpose compute because of the
agreed.
software,
Totally
like
agreed.
ARM, right?
100%. Yep.
But yeah, in the unless all the auto companies sort of standardize on a common operating system, it's going to be a very different landscape. And they're not going to do that, right? They've seen that playbook, so they're going to
Yeah.
try really hard not to standardize. And so RISC-V is a pretty interesting alternative for them.
Yeah. Agreed. I love this topic, and I like it again for the point that you made that there's more questions than answers. That's my favorite part when cycles like that happen in the industry. So I'm assuming we'll have many, many more things to talk about automotive, but we'll wrap for there. I know you're going to be at MWC, so anybody that's listening to this, feel free to reach out to Jay, on Twitter, at Jay Goldberg. I think we have our contact information on circuit.fm. I won't be, happily, but Jay will be. So yeah, we teased a bunch of episodes.
Yeah.
There's some good content coming. So I'm looking forward. Everyone should hopefully look forward to that.
I am.
Cool. Yeah. Cool. All right.
All right. Cool. Good talking to you.
Talk to you, everyone. All right. Bye.
Bye.